Hello and welcome to the MovieKing Podcast. My name is David Jurmann and I'll be your host. On today's show, I'll be reviewing and ranting about the film Kraven the Hunter. So let's get right into it. It's the newest addition to Sony's Marvel universe, not to be mistaken with the MCU from Marvel Studios, which is including stuff like Guardians of the Galaxy, all the Avengers movies, Black Panther, even the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies, which are from Sony but do take place in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But no, this is the SSU, Sony's Spider-Man universe as they call it, which ironically, I think, doesn't have Spider-Man himself in it, but has several connections to the character. Like, it spends all this time setting up these characters who are very famous for interacting with Spider-Man, or, you know, even having a connection to Spider-Man, but then we're not even going to have Spider-Man in this world. It makes no sense at all, especially when you consider Sony owns the rights to Spider-Man. Like, it would make sense if, like, Marvel Studios was doing this, because, like, if they couldn't get the rights to Spider-Man, they're just using characters around Spider-Man. Maybe that would make more sense, but, like, no, this is literally a company that owns Spider-Man, and they're just choosing not to do Spider-Man movies at all, because I guess they don't want to conflict with the Tom Holland ones, or they don't want to conflict with the Across the Spider-Verse, Into the Spider-Verse movies. They maybe just, I don't know, it's very confusing. I mean, the first Venom movie, which is what kind of started this all, did very well financially, so maybe Sony just kind of learned the wrong lesson, which they often do. They probably just learned the wrong lesson and thought, like, hey, people will go see a movie without Spider-Man in it, even if, you know, we just make a character that connects to him, like Venom. And Venom is a big character. But look, I think I could speak for most people and say most people wanted to see Venom interact with Spider-Man at some point within this trilogy. The fact that we never got that, I think, is a sin in of itself. But, look, we're done with Venom, we're done with all that. Let's move on, though. I mean, this universe started in 2018 and consists of the Venom trilogy, Morbius, Madam Web, and now Kraven. I mean, it's been going on a long time, and we haven't seen any Spider-Man crossover in here. We've been hinting at stuff, especially in Morbius, in the post-credits scene, which, terrible, terrible movie. And look, I had no faith in Kraven as a movie. Everything Sony touches from the Marvel characters that isn't Spider-Verse related is hot garbage, besides Venom, which is more lukewarm. I don't really like Venom, but it's the most watchable, certainly, out of all of these, because, you know, both Morbius and Madam Web have been publicly humiliated for how lame they were. They don't respect the audience, they don't respect the characters, and they don't even seem to respect the people making these movies. I mean, there have been clear instances where Sony has just made the movie themselves and, like, clearly just disregarded any of the people involved with them. That's certainly how it feels anyway. And Kraven, like the other two movies I mentioned, you know, Morbius and Madam Web, it is plagued with so many terrible, terrible choices, like bad ADR, awful visual effects, terrible writing, and a generic story to tie it all together. It really doesn't feel like any one person made this movie. You know, it feels like something made by committee, like it was made by Sony executives who just completely tore the movie apart in the editing room and reshot a lot of what they didn't like. I'm pretty sure I read somewhere that Kraven did have a few rounds of reshoots, or a round of reshoots. It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, this movie was supposed to come out a while ago. I think Morbius had some reshoots too. I literally can't think of a single thing in this movie that worked for me. You know, like the performances, usually that's something I can find, like a redeeming quality in the movie from someone. The performances are all bad here. These are all good actors, by the way. Like, no one here, you know, if you just showed me this movie, like, on paper and said, like, we got all these actors in it, I'd be like, oh, that's awesome. These are all very good actors. But they're terrible here. It's an awful mix of seemingly no direction and awful writing that leaves a lot to be desired. You know, like, nobody has any personality. Not Aaron Taylor Johnson, not Ariana DeBose, not Russell Crowe. Like, these are all people who have good acting abilities. I mean, Aaron Taylor Johnson, I really liked him in Bullet Train, which I think is why Sony really liked him. I mean, between Bullet Train and Kraven the Hunter, Sony actually really liked this guy. Ariana DeBose is also a very talented actor. I mean, she won Best Supporting Actress for West Side Story a few years ago. And then you have Russell Crowe, which is like, Russell Crowe. I mean, he's Gladiator, man. Like, how hard is this? Like, these are all very good actors. I don't know what happened here. It's really hard to believe this is the director J.C. Chandor's fault, too. I'm not familiar with his other work, but similar to other movies Sony has made, especially in this universe, they don't feel like a creative vision. As I said, it really just feels like Sony execs were behind the whole thing, making the whole thing up as they went along, not really listening to feedback or anything. They were just kind of like doing a test screening, probably. Didn't probably go very well because the movie's crap, and then they just reworked it some more, made it even more crap, and now that's what we have. I don't know, that's what it feels like anyway. Again, because it's really hard to believe this is the filmmaker's vision. Like, we had this whole conversation with Madam Web when it came out. It just doesn't feel like something made by a person. Like, someone really put their time and heart into this. Like, it feels like it was just all stripped away in the editing room. That's really what it feels like here. And look, maybe this was a good movie at some point. I don't know, but it's not that anymore. I don't like the characters in this movie. None of them are anything more than two-dimensional and have the bare minimum of development. They're not likable. They really just don't have any personality. It's also a betrayal of who Kraven is from the comics, so it's not even an accurate representation of who the guy is. He's not a villain in this movie, and he just comes off as a generic assassin. I would never believe this guy could ever take on Spider-Man, or I don't even really want to see this Kraven take on Spider-Man. Like, I mean, I was someone who was really excited when, we had the idea of Spider-Man No Way Home, and maybe Kraven was going to be the villain in that. I was one who was, like, very for that. I don't really ever want to see this Kraven face off like Tom Holland's Spider-Man, because, at least in this state, with these writers, like, this Kraven is just so forgettable. Like, I don't really feel like he was ever a threat to anyone. I mean, he says he's a threat, and he looks like he could be a threat, but he just doesn't do anything that interesting. I really didn't care about his character at all. And look, let's talk about the action. It looks like it was taken out of a movie in 2005. The CGI is terrible. Like, this looks awful. This movie looks so bad. It's overly glossy and smooth. Like, the whole thing just looks like it has a filter over it. The editing is terrible and makes the choreography look messy. And then it's packed with these ridiculous powers from Kraven that had me laughing from how stupid he looks using them. Like, he's just, running on the wall. Like, but it doesn't look convincing. Like, I've seen this in, a case maybe where it looks kind of cool, like, just the way he's, like, climbing on walls. Like, Hulk could do that pretty well. This guy can't sell it, especially with these visual effects. It looks really cheesy, really outdated. It just doesn't look like someone who's doing anything cool. It just looks like Rubber Guy, just on the wall. It looks really bad. And the story itself is so lame, too. It's not even much of a story. You spend a lot of the time, too much time in the first act, learning about Kraven as a kid and his upbringing, sort of how he became who he was. There was potential, I think, for this to become, emotionally charged and set everything up for what happens later in the movie. But the fact of the matter is it's so cheesy and poorly acted. There was just really nothing to connect to. There's a scene with this older woman talking to a young boy and sort of like, telling him about the future that made me laugh out loud. I'm not even kidding. Like, it made me laugh. Really, like, it wasn't supposed to be funny. This isn't supposed to be like a funny scene. But the delivery was so bad. The execution was terrible that I was just like finding it very funny. Which leads me onto the writing, really, because the writing is also atrocious. Like, seriously atrocious. There were so many terrible lines of dialogue, some that I can't even believe were approved by people. Like, I can't imagine someone looking at the script saying, yeah, that's a good line of dialogue, because they're so robotic. Like, one that's been going around online, and I find it very funny, is this woman who says, and then she died, and I never saw her again. Like, hello, that's what dying means. I'm sorry, like, this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Like, I gotta repeat that again. And then she died, and I never saw her again. Like, yes, if you died, I'm not gonna see you again. Like, it's just, what are these lines? Like, who wrote them? It feels like something like AI wrote. I don't know. Really, really bad. I don't know who came up with that. And then it's not helped by the fact that the characters all talk like robots, and there's no personality or charisma to any of them. As I said, like, this movie clearly has a lot of ADR, which is kind of when it's a trick movies use when characters like aren't looking at the camera and you just have like the actor in post just kind of record lines over so they can kind of say something different from what they said before when they were filming it. And sometimes it can be used in, subtle ways, like if you use it very lightly. This movie uses it a lot, similar to Madam Web and Morbius and all these movies that just, it's very clearly reshoots and they didn't know what to do. It's just such a bad way of doing things, and it makes the performances worse too because everyone just doesn't sound interested in what they're talking about. The Rhino is a character who's in this movie, and I like the character like in the comics and video games that I've seen, even the movies. I didn't mind the Paul Giamatti Rhino at all, honestly, but like the Rhino in this movie, literally every line out of his mouth made me roll my eyes or laugh. I don't know how much is on the actor or director, but the words themselves were ridiculously bad and stupid. I really, oh my god, like the Rhino, he's the best part of this movie because he's the only part that's actually kind of entertaining, but the rest is so bad. And also he looks terrible. The CGI on the Rhino, he looks so goofy. I just couldn't believe, like, again, I couldn't believe someone approved that. I'm like, who thought that was a good idea? This is a whole movie, just who thought any of this was a good idea? And there's another character who is supposed to be able to do good impressions of people, and they use it in the dumbest ways imaginable. Like, there's a scene where he has to sing, and it just sounds like it sounds like they just took the song from, like, Spotify and just put it over his mouth like he lip synced it. Like, I was just like, what are they doing? What are they doing here? Just despite some really funny scenes here and there in this movie, the movie commits the biggest sin in all of cinema. It's a sin so bad that if you do it, like, the whole movie's ruined. No matter how, fine the rest of the movie might have been, it kills the whole thing. And that's that this movie is so boring. Like, really boring. It's paced horribly, and the story is so bad, and the characters are so dull, and the action is so lame, and the performances are so flat, that there was nothing to be invested in. Nothing. I was getting tired watching this movie, and I was fighting just to stay focused on what was happening, because it was just not able to keep my attention. It really wasn't. There was nothing to focus on. There were nothing interesting that the characters were talking about where I'm like, ooh, I want to see where that goes later. None of that. Like, if this movie was on TV, I would have just been fine turning it off, not knowing what happens next, because that's the kind of movie this is. Here's the thing, though. I've seen some people online say their audience was, like, constantly laughing at the movie, and I'm sure that makes a huge difference in how entertaining the movie is. Like, absolutely. If you have an audience that's having a great time with it, and, you're able to have fun there, then I'm sure you're going to say it's a lot more enjoyable than I am, but I've seen some very unintentionally funny movies by myself, or even just with a few friends, and have been able to laugh hysterically at them. This was a showing where people only laughed a few times in my audience, and that energy where it's like everyone's really laughing in unison wasn't there. But the fact of the matter is that I think even if that energy was there, right? Like, let's say everyone was laughing at the showing I went to, that experience would be completely absent on my own at home, or if I went to see the movie again in theaters and had a different type of audience. And I wouldn't be laughing that much to begin with, because the movie does have a few very funny sequences, but not enough that makes, like, the whole thing really a guilty pleasure to me. Like, some movies I can just call a guilty pleasure because I'm just having so much fun watching it. This movie's too boring to say it's a guilty pleasure in my experience. Similar to Red 1, which I think has some very funny scenes individually. Like, if you just pick out a few scenes, I'm like, yeah, that's very funny. As a whole, though, it's not worth the experience to get those scenes. But look, if you enjoyed this movie, I mean, I'm glad for you. I really think it's awesome. Like, if you were able to find enjoyment or laugh at it or actually, like, genuinely enjoy it, like, that's cool. I just really hated this movie. I really, really hated it. It's not the worst I've seen ever. It's nothing like top 10 of all time bad, but it's certainly one of the worst of the year. It's the worst of Sony's Spider-Man universe with no Spider-Man in it. The best way I can describe this movie is to have you imagine the most lame version of a Kraven the Hunter movie you can, and now make it even more lame, and you have this movie. I was pretty harsh on the movie Werewolves last episode, but at least that felt like it was trying to be a real movie. Like, I can at least respect a movie a little bit and not want to, like, poo-poo on it too much when I feel like they actually tried to make a movie and they put a lot of time and effort. Effort is something I appreciate, because if I feel like you tried, then I want to watch it, and I at least want to support what you make next. Like, I want to support those movies. But this movie just doesn't feel like a movie. It feels like something made by committee that wasn't trying very hard. It feels like it was phoned in, and kind of like Red One, and I really don't like those movies. Those are some of my least favorites ever, and some of my least favorites of the year. So I'm sad to say I have to give this movie a big giant F. If this truly is the end of Sony's current Spider-Man universe, then I'm glad to see it go, and I hope that if they do try again, they do something better and with, more creativity and more effort, and maybe I'll give it a shot then. But for now, this is the worst thing they've made, and it is one of the worst comic book movies I've ever seen. And that about does it for this episode. If you want to follow my reviews, you can find me on Letterboxd at MovieKing1224. You can also listen to this podcast on your favorite apps such as Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. If you have any comments or feedback, I would love to hear it and improve the show. And of course, if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell to hear more like it. I appreciate you all so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.